branded on the cheek and cast out. A cowboy hid her scar and gave her dignity. The mule was the first thing that told me something was wrong. I'd been tracking that animal for 2 days, not hunting her, not buying her, just watching her work the same shallow creek bottom every morning, head down in the reeds, ears turning slow like she was listening for something I couldn't hear. Mules don't spook easy. That's the first thing you learn about them if you spend any time in rough country. A horse will bolt at a shadow. A mule will stand in a burning barn thinking it over. So when I came down off the ridge that third morning and saw her head come up hard, ears pinned forward, nostrils going, I stopped. I didn't reach for anything. I just stopped and watched what she was watching. It was a woman. She was maybe 60 yards south of me, moving along the far bank of the creek in a low crouch that wasn't quite a walk and wasn't quite a crawl. More like something between the two. The kind of movement you only learn when staying low is the difference between living and not. She had a bundle pressed to her chest, tied in what looked like a flour sack, and she moved without lifting her feet all the way off the ground, each step placed careful on the gravel like she was afraid the sound would carry. I didn't call out to her, I just watched. She made it to the willows on the far side, pushed through them, and disappeared. The mule went back to grazing. I stood there another minute, maybe 2, listening to the creek and the morning birds starting up in the cottonwoods further along. Then I picked my way down to the water and crossed. I found her on the other side of the willows, sitting with her back against a boulder, the bundle in her lap, her eyes shut. She was breathing through her nose, slow and deliberate, the way a person breathes when they're trying to convince their body everything's fine. Her dress was torn at the hem and caked with red mud to the knee. One boot had the sole beginning to separate, the leather tonguing open at the toe. She had dark hair, most of it loose, one side of it falling across her face in a way that wasn't accidental. When she heard my boots on the gravel, she went absolutely still, didn't open her eyes. Didn't move, just froze the way prey freezes, the way something does when it's figured out that going still is the only option left to it. I crouched down about 8 feet from her and set my hat on the ground between us. That was all I did, set my hat down and waited. It took a long time, maybe 3 minutes, then she opened her eyes. She looked at me hard, not the soft look of somebody hoping to be helped, the measuring look, the one that's adding things up quick. She looked at my hands first, which told me something about the men she'd been around. Then she looked at my face, then back at my hands. I said, "I've got hard biscuit and salt pork if you're hungry. No fire right now, but the biscuit's not bad cold." She didn't say anything. I said, "I'm not going to ask you where you're going or where you've been." A long pause, then she said, "Why not?" "Because it's not my business." She watched me. The hair was still across the left side of her face. She kept it there without seeming to think about it, the way you stop thinking about a habit once it's old enough. I said, "My name's Callum. I run traps in the spring and I'm hired on at the Aldrich place come fall. Right now I'm between those two things." She said, "You're between things." "That's right." She looked at me a long time more. Then she said, "Nora." I nodded. I reached into my coat pocket and came out with the biscuit and the pork wrapped in cloth, and I put it on the flat of the boulder beside her, not close enough that she'd have to reach near me to take it. Then I stood and walked back to the creek. I stood there a good while, listening to the water and looking at nothing in particular. When I heard her moving behind me, I didn't turn around. After a while she said, "Where's the Aldrich place?" 2 days east, I said, "if you stay on the creek bottom." "How far is town?" "Mercer, half a day, maybe less." "Quiet." She said, "I don't want to go to Mercer." "All right." Another long pause. She said, "Why all right? You don't know anything about me." I turned around then. She was standing maybe 5 feet from me, the bundle back at her chest, her hair still across the left side of her face, looking at me with those measuring eyes. I said, "No, I don't. You don't know anything about me either. Seems like we're starting even." She thought about that for a while. I picked up my hat from where I'd left it on the gravel, put it back on my head, and started east along the creek. I didn't invite her to come. I didn't ask. I just walked. By the time I'd gone 100 yards, I could hear her footsteps behind me. That was how it started. Not with any great talk, not with any promise made. Just a woman with her hair across her face and a man walking east, and something in between that neither of us named for a good while. I want to tell this right because it isn't the kind of thing that comes out right if you rush it. The years have a way of smoothing over the hard parts when you look back, making a thing seem softer than it was, and what it was in those first days was hard. Not between us, between her and the rest of it. We camped that first night under a cutbank where the creek had taken a bite out of the prairie during some old flood. Dry enough. Good cover. I built the smallest fire I could manage, just enough to heat the pork, and I watched her eat without watching her, if you know what I mean, looking off at the dark. You learn that habit around people who aren't used to being comfortable. You don't look at them directly when they're doing something as raw as eating. She'd put more of her hair across her face by then, and the firelight was doing things with shadows anyway, so I still hadn't seen the left side of her clear. After she'd eaten, she said, "You have a rifle." "I do." "And the pistol?" "Yes." "Are you good with them?" I thought about that for a moment. Good enough to have not needed them in a while, which is the best kind of answer. She thought about that too. Then she said, "There are 3 men. They came from the Heston outfit, which is 6 hours south. They'll be looking for me by now." I kept looking at the fire. "Are you theirs?" The pause that came after that question told me more than the answer. It was the pause of somebody who'd been asked that in different ways by different men, and had learned that the answer didn't usually change anything. She said, "I was hired on as a cook. Last spring, there was a contract." "And you left the contract?" "Yes." "I waited." She said, "The contract didn't say what it turned out to say." I nodded. That was enough. That was more than enough. I said, "How far back are they?" "This morning I heard one of them on the ridge. The big one, Purvis, he makes noise when he walks. I don't think he found my tracks at the creek." "He won't," I said. "Gravel bottom for a quarter mile either way." She looked at me. "How do you know that?" "Because I've been working this creek for 3 springs." She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "All right." I banked the fire down to almost nothing and said, "I'll take first watch." She lay down with the bundle under her head. I sat against the cutbank with the rifle across my lap and looked at the dark for 4 hours until the moon set. Then I woke her the way you wake somebody who's been sleeping scared. I said her name from across the fire, not too loud, twice. She came up sharp, hand reaching for something that wasn't there, and then she settled and looked at me. "Your turn," I said. She watched the dark steadily and well, better than most men I'd worked with. In the morning, she was already up before first light, crouched over the rebuilt fire, moving the pork around in the pan with the end of a stick. She'd learned something about small fires, too, from somewhere. It barely smoked. I came and sat across from her. The angle of the early light was different from the night before, and the hair had shifted. I saw it. I didn't mean to, and I didn't linger on it, and I looked away quick, but I saw it, and I think she knew I'd seen it, because she moved her hand up to her face in a motion that had so much practice in it, so much pure repetition, that it was barely a movement at all. Just a hand going to the same place it always went. The left side of her jaw, up toward her cheekbone. There were letters burned into the skin there. I'd only seen it for a second, but it was enough to make out the shape of it. Not cattle letters, a man's initials. Done small and precise, which somehow made it worse. I looked at the fire. She looked at the fire. We ate. Neither of us said anything about it. There wasn't anything to say, not then. What a man would do with his brand iron and a woman who wanted to leave, you didn't need to say anything about that. The saying of it didn't make it any different. After a while I said, "The Aldrich place is a working spread. Elsa Aldrich is a widow, has been for 4 years. She runs it with 2 hired men, and she's been needing a cook since the fall." Nora looked at me. I said, "She's a fair woman, no nonsense. Doesn't ask much of people she doesn't need to know." Long quiet. Nora said, "And you'd vouch for me." "I'll say you're a cook and you're hired. That's all the vouching you'd need." She looked at me a long time. I could feel her adding things up again, measuring the risk of it. She said, "What do you get?" I looked at her then, directly. "A cook," I said, "and a woman who can watch." She held my eyes for a moment, then she turned back to the fire. The second day was harder. We were out of the creek bottom by noon, crossing open grass, and there was no cover for a long stretch. I put her in the middle and I walked 10 yards back, watching our trail, and she kept up a pace that surprised me. That torn boot slapping on the ground, and she didn't say a word about it. Around midday, I heard something on the south wind. Not a voice, not hooves, just something that wasn't grass. I put my hand up, and she stopped without a question. We stood still for a good 2 minutes. Then it shifted, whatever it was, or the wind did, and it was gone. She looked back at me. I shook my head once. She turned, and we kept walking. That evening we made better camp in a shallow draw with good sight lines to the south and east. I cut some green willow branches and leaned them into an overhang in the draw wall, which kept the light of the fire from going anywhere useful. And she'd found something in her bundle, dried herbs of some kind. I don't know the name of it, that she put in the water. And whatever it was, it made the creek water go down easier and left a smell in the camp that wasn't unpleasant. She was particular about things like that, small specific things. While I was cleaning the rifle, she said, out of nowhere, "What did you do before the trapping?" I thought about it. "Other things," I said. "Other things. Work that came to me, some of it I don't talk about." She watched me run the cloth down the barrel. "You were a bounty man," she said, not a question. "I kept working, for a while. And before that I was in a war, the wrong part of one." She was quiet, then she said, "The wrong part." "The part that loses," I said, "and then spends a long time not knowing what to do about that." She nodded slowly, like she understood something about that, not the war but the part about not knowing what to do after. I said, "The trapping suited me. You're alone most of the time. The animal either goes in the trap or it doesn't. There's no negotiating with it." She almost smiled, the right side of her face. "I understand that. I figured you might." We sat with the fire between us and the dark all around, and neither of us felt the need to fill it up with words, which told me something. A person who can sit quiet with a near stranger without getting nervous, that's somebody who's been genuinely alone. Not just by themselves, but alone in the deeper way. The way where the quiet inside gets as big as the quiet outside and you stop being afraid of either one. I'd been alone like that since the war. I'd stopped minding it a long time ago. But sitting there that second night, I noticed something. The alone didn't feel exactly the same as it had the morning before. Still there, still mostly mine. But a degree smaller maybe, a degree less absolute. I didn't name it then. I'm naming it now because otherwise it doesn't make sense, what came later. We reached the Aldrich spread on the morning of the third day, came in along the fence line from the north, which was how I always came in. Elsa Aldrich was out by the barn when we arrived, talking to one of the hired men, Pico, who'd been with the place for years and who was a good enough hand but talked too much. He stopped talking when he saw us coming. Elsa Aldrich was a big woman, not in the fat sense but in the solid sense, the sense of a person who's carried weight for years and developed the frame for it. She had gray in her hair that she didn't bother doing anything about, and the squint of somebody who spends most of their time outside looking at things at distance. She looked at me, then at Nora, then back at me. I said, "Mrs. Aldrich, this is Nora, she's your new cook." Elsa Aldrich looked at me for a moment in the way she always did when she thought something needed more explaining. Then she looked at Nora, directly, squarely, the way this woman looked at everything, and Nora looked back at her without flinching, which I noted. Elsa said, "Can you bake?" Nora said, "Yes." "Biscuits and bread or just biscuits?" "Bread, biscuits, pie crust if you have lard." "I have lard," Elsa said. "Can you manage a wood range?" "Better than a fire." Elsa looked at her another few seconds. Then she looked at me. Then she said to Nora, "Come inside, I'll show you where things are." That was it, that was the whole of it. Nora followed her toward the house. At the door she glanced back once, not at the land or the sky, at me. Then she went inside. Pico said, "Who is she?" I said, "The cook." "Where'd she come from?" I looked at him. "From somewhere south," I said. "You need more than that, ask Mrs. Aldrich." He didn't. Pico was a talker, but he had sense enough to know when a topic was finished. The first week I worked the fence line on the east pasture, which needed it bad, and slept in the bunkhouse with Pico and a young hand named Duart who barely spoke English, but who was quick with everything he put his hands to. I didn't go near the house except for meals, which we all took in the kitchen. The kitchen was Nora's now. You could tell it within a day. Not because she rearranged it in any dramatic way, she moved only what needed moving, but because of the smell of it and the order of things on the shelf and the way the fire in the range burned more even than it had before. Pico couldn't stop talking about the food. Duarte just ate. I ate and kept my eyes on my plate mostly. But I watched her from across the table, in the way you can watch someone without them being sure you are. The way she moved around the kitchen was the movement of somebody who'd spent years being able to anticipate what men needed before they asked for it. Efficient and quiet and a little wary still, even here, the hair still down on the left side. On the fourth morning I came in early before the other two, and she was at the range alone. She heard me come in and she said without turning, "Sit down, coffee's ready." I sat. She poured it and set the cup in front of me and went back to the range. I said, "How are you sleeping?" "Well enough. Mrs. Aldrich treat you right." "She's fair," Nora said, "like you said." I drank my coffee. She said without looking at me, "No one's come." "No one will," I said, "not here." I said it with more certainty than I completely felt, but I felt most of it. She turned and looked at me then. From across the kitchen, both hands on the edge of the range, the morning light coming through the single window on the right side of her face only. She looked at me for a long time. She said, "How can you be sure?" "Because a man from the Heston outfit rides onto Aldrich land. Elsa Aldrich will know about it before he gets to the fence gate," I said. "She's got 3 years of friends between here and Mercer, and she knows which way every stranger comes." Nora looked at me. "And if they got that far," I said, "they'd have to get through me before they got to the house." She held my eyes for a moment, then she turned back to the range. After a long while she said quietly, "No one said that to me before." I didn't answer right away, then I said, "Well, it's true. 3 weeks in, it was Pico who caused the trouble, not out of malice. Pico wasn't a malicious man. He was a man with a mouth that was always ahead of his thinking. He went into Mercer for supplies on a Friday, and he came back that evening a shade too loud, having stopped somewhere on the way back that he shouldn't have. And at supper he said, not to Nora, not directed at her, just out loud to the table the way a drunk man says things, "Heard something in town about a woman from the Heston outfit that ran off. They say she's branded." The table went quiet. Nora was at the range. Her back was to us. She didn't move, didn't turn. Her shoulders were very still. Pico said, "Some kind of letter burned on her cheek. They say the man did it himself, Heston did. Say she stole from him." Duarte looked at his plate. Elsa Aldrich looked at Pico with a look I wouldn't have wanted pointed at me. I said, "Pico." He looked at me. I said, "Finish your food." Something in my voice got through the liquor. He looked at his plate and finished his supper and didn't say any more about it. After the meal, he went outside. Duarte went after him. Elsa Aldrich stood up and collected plates in her deliberate way, the way she did everything, and carried them to the wash basin. She said to no one in particular, "Heston's a fool and a coward." She said it plain, the way she'd say the weather was coming in. Then she went to bed. I was still at the table. Nora was still at the range, moving things that didn't need moving. She had her back to me. After a long while she said, "Now you know." "I knew before," I said. She turned partway around. "How?" "I'm not blind." She looked at me sideways, the hair in its usual place. I said, "Come sit down." She stood where she was for a moment. Then she came and sat across from me at the table. The first time she'd sat with me at a table, first time she'd sat in the kitchen at all that I'd ever seen. I looked at her directly. "What Heston is doesn't change what you are," I said. She looked at me a long time. The firelight from the range was warm on the right side of her face. The left side was still in shadow. She said, "Most men, when they find out, they look at it different." "I know," I said. She said, "Like it's evidence of something. Like it tells them who I am." "It tells me who he is," I said. "That's the only information in it." She was quiet. Her hands were flat on the table, and I could see she was holding them deliberately still. I said, "You don't have to do anything with that. I'm not asking for anything." She looked at her hands, then she looked up at me. She said, "What are you asking for then?" "Nothing," I said. "I'm telling you something so you know it's there." She held my eyes for a long moment. Something crossed her face that wasn't quite what I'd call an expression, more like a small shift in some held thing. Some weight she'd been carrying so long she'd stopped noticing the carrying of it. She said, "All right." All right, I said. We sat there a while longer. The range ticked and settled. The lamplight was yellow and warm. I want to tell you about a morning, maybe 6 weeks into it, because this is where the thing I was watching turned into the thing I knew. I'd been up before daylight to check the east fence again. We'd had cattle pressure from a neighboring herd moving through, and some of the posts were working loose. I came back in around 7, cold and a little dirty, and I came through the kitchen because the kitchen door was the closer one. Nora was at the table, not cooking, just sitting with a cup of coffee in both hands, looking out the window at the flat gray of the morning sky. She was sitting with her back straight and her head up and both hands around the cup, and the hair was not across her face. It was pulled back, loose but pulled back, and the left side of her face was just there, the way a face is. The mark was plain in the morning light, the letters burned in small and even on the rise of her cheekbone, and she was sitting with it showing the way you sit with something you've decided is yours. I don't think she'd meant for me to see her like that, but she didn't move when I came in. I hung my coat on the hook and got a cup and poured coffee from the pot and sat down across from her. Not too close, not too far, the way I'd crouched down at the creek those first weeks back, leaving the right amount of room. I didn't look at the mark on her face. I didn't pointedly not look at it either. I just looked at her face the way you look at someone's face when you're talking to them. I said, "Wind's picking up from the north." She said, "Snow, you think? Maybe by afternoon." She nodded. We drank our coffee. The kitchen was quiet except for the tick of the range. After a while she said, "Callum." "Yeah." She looked at me, "Thank you." I looked back at her. I knew she wasn't talking about the snow. I said, "You don't need to thank me for anything." She said, "I know I don't need to. I want to." I held her eyes. They were steady eyes, dark, with the particular kind of steadiness that comes from having had to be steady for too long and learning at some point to just leave it there. I said, "All right, you're welcome." She almost smiled. The right side of her face and then the left side of it too, the mark on her cheekbone in the light, not anything to hide. The 3 men from the Heston outfit came on a Saturday. I knew they were coming before I saw them. The mule, that old mule from the creek, who'd wandered north onto Aldrich land by some route of her own, put her head up in the far pasture the same way she had that first morning. I'd gotten in the habit of watching her. I was at the fence gate when they rode up, 3 of them. The one in front was Purvis, the big one that made noise when he walked. The other 2 I didn't know. They rode up to the gate and stopped. Purvis said, "You the hand that brought a woman in here 3 weeks back?" I said, "Who's asking?" He said, "Heston outfit. We're looking for a woman that left the employ of the ranch without completing her contract." I looked at all 3 of them, each in turn. Then I said, "I don't know anything about that." Purvis said, "She's branded, left side of her face, you'd have noticed." I said, "Lots of women on this ranch, none of them branded." He looked at me. He was trying to work out if I was a man who'd back down or a man who wouldn't. Men like Purvis are always doing that calculation, and they're usually right about it because usually the calculation comes out the way they expect. I just looked at him. He said, "We'd like to speak to the woman of the house." "She's busy," I said. Purvis looked over my shoulder at the ranch buildings. "We'll just take a look around." "You won't," I said. He looked back at me. I said, "You ride onto this property, you ride past this gate. I'll drop the first 2 horses and the 3rd man will have to answer to Mrs. Aldrich, which I wouldn't wish on him. And when the Mercer sheriff gets here, and he will get here, because Mrs. Aldrich has her ways and so do I, there'll be 3 trespassing charges, and whatever else the county attorney decides to make of a brand iron used on a woman's face." Long silence, the horses shifted. The wind was cold and steady from the north. Purvis looked at me for a while, then he spat off to the side and reined his horse around. The other 2 followed. I watched them until they were small against the brown grass, and then nothing at all. I stood there at the gate a while longer, watching the south. Then I heard boots on the hard ground behind me, and I turned, and Nora was standing 10 yards back. She had my other rifle, the shorter one I kept on the rack inside, broken open and loaded and closed again, held in both hands across her body, not pointed at anything, just held the way someone holds a tool they know how to use. She was looking at where the riders had gone. I said, "You didn't have to come out." She said, "I know." I looked at her. She looked back at me. She had the hair pulled back again, the way she'd had it that morning in the kitchen, the mark on her cheekbone plain in the flat gray light. She said, I wasn't going to let you stand out here alone. I held her eyes, she held mine. I said, they won't come back. Not once word gets to Mercer. I know, she said, I know that, she paused. I still wasn't going to let you stand out here alone. I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say to it that would make it better than it already was. We walked back to the house together. The wind was picking up, bending the grass south. She handed me the rifle inside and went to the range without a word, and I hung both rifles on the rack and stood there a moment, looking at nothing. Elsa Aldrich came in from the back with a bucket of eggs. She looked at me, then at Nora's back, then at me again. She said, Gone. Gone, I said. She set the eggs on the counter. Good, she said, that was all. I want to tell you about a night in December, because this is the other end of the thing. The snow had come in earnest by then, real winter, the kind that makes the whole world go quiet and still in a way that's got nothing peaceful about it. It's the quiet of something being suppressed, held down, waiting. The cattle had been moved to the south pasture where there was better shelter, and we'd been running short daily just keeping the water troughs open. The four of us, Elsa, Nora, Duarte, Pico, had eaten supper in the kitchen, the small kitchen that was the warmest room in the house, and Elsa and Pico had gone to their respective beds, and Duarte had gone to the bunkhouse, and I'd been the last one up and had been sitting at the table with the lamp turned down, doing nothing in particular. Just sitting. Nora had gone to bed an hour before, or so I'd thought. She came in from the back of the house in her coat and sat down across from me. She sat with her hands on the table. I looked at her. She said, I can't sleep. All right. She looked at the lamp flame. It was small and very steady in the still kitchen. She said, I keep thinking about the creek, the first day. I waited. She said, I'd been walking for 2 days and I'd had water and nothing else, and I sat down behind that rock and I thought, this might be the end of it. Not in the way of giving up, just in the way of things running out. She paused. And then I heard your boots on the gravel, she said, and you crouched down and you put your hat on the ground between us. She looked at me. She said, I've thought about that a lot. Why the hat? Because it was in my hands, I said, and I didn't want you to see my hands empty. She looked at me. A hat on the ground isn't a threat, I said. It's nothing, it's just here's a thing I've got and I'm setting it down. She kept looking at me. I said, I don't know if that makes sense. She said, it makes sense. She paused. It's the first thing any man's ever done that made sense to me. I sat with that. She reached across the table. She put her hand over mine on the tabletop, not grabbing, not squeezing, just resting there the way you rest something that's been heavy and you want to set down for a minute. I turned my hand over under hers, slow. And she let me, and we sat like that, her hand in mine in the lamplight, the snow doing something quiet outside the window, the kitchen dark except for that one small flame. She said, I don't know what I am to you. I said, you're Nora. She looked at me. That's what you are, I said. Whatever else comes of it, that's the start of it. You're Nora and you're here, and I'm glad you're here. She was quiet a long time. Her hand was warm. Then she said, I'm glad I'm here too. That was all, that was enough. I'll tell you how it looks now, if you want to know. The snow goes away every year and comes back every year, and in between those two things there's a ranch to run, and we run it. Elsa Aldrich put me on as foreman 2 seasons back, which was her decision, and I didn't argue about it. Duarte's still here. Pico still talks too much. Nora and I married in the spring of that second year in Mercer with Elsa Aldrich as the witness, which made it official enough. The man who married us asked her name, and she said, Nora Voss, because she'd been using the name she'd had before all of it, her own name, and now it had the other name behind it, which is how she wanted it. Nobody from the Heston outfit ever came back. Heston himself died that first winter, his heart, and the outfit broke up shortly after, and the thing that had seemed so fixed and enormous, the threat of those men, the weight of what had been done to her, just dissolved away like it had never been real. Which is both a relief and a particular kind of anger, that something that shaped so much of her life could just be gone like it hadn't mattered. But that's the way of those things. The pain was real even after the cause of it is gone. She still wears her hair back most of the time, has for years. I think she got tired of the habit of hiding somewhere in that first winter and let it go, and what she found on the other side of the habit was nothing much. The mark on her face, her cheekbone in the light when she looks at me. I've looked at it so many times now that it's just part of how I know her. The way you know someone, all the small specific things of them, the particular way a face goes when it's thinking something, the sound of their boots on a wood floor, the way they hold a cup. The mark is part of all of that. She told me once, not long after the wedding, that what she'd been most afraid of, not the men looking for her, not the winter, was that there wasn't a place in the world where she was just herself, where the mark wasn't the first thing and the only thing. I told her I couldn't speak for the world. I told her I could only speak for this place and what I knew of it. She looked at me in that way she has, the steady way. I said, "Here, you're Nora Voss, and I've never once thought of anything else first." She held my eyes for a long time. Then she put her hand against my chest, flat, the way you feel for a heartbeat, and she left it there. The lamp was burning low. The snow was starting up outside, the early season snow, the light kind that doesn't stick. And I put my hand over hers on my chest, and I thought, this is the thing. Not the war, not the bounty years, not the long string of seasons working alone. This. Her hand on my chest, and the snow outside, and the warmth of the kitchen, and the woman I stood in front of a gate for, the woman who walked out with a rifle because she wasn't going to let me stand alone. Nobody in my life had ever done that before, come out to stand beside me. Nobody had ever looked at me and decided I was worth standing beside. That's what she gave me, not soft words about it, not ceremony. Just a woman who walked out into the cold with a rifle in her hands and stood beside me, and refused to let me be alone in it. I am 63 years old this winter. I have been cold more often than I've been warm, and I have been wrong more often than I've been right, and I have done some things I won't describe here because they belong to the past, and the past is gone. But I have been the man that woman walked out to stand beside, and I have been the man she put her hand on in the lamplight, and whatever else I am or was or failed to be, I am those two things, and I will be them until I can't. The snow's coming down now outside this window. Real snow, the winter kind that means it. Her footsteps in the back of the house, the particular sound of them, the particular weight. I'm going to go in there now and sit at the table while she works, and I'm going to watch the snow through the glass, and I'm not going to say anything much, and neither is she, and the kitchen will be warm, and that will be enough. That will be more than enough.